This year is the 60th anniversary of I Have a Dream. It's been 60 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. told a crowd of some 250,000 of people in Washington about his dream of a world without racism. Of the 2,500 or more speeches he gave during his life cut short, this one is definitely the most famous. Before King gives this speech at the March on Washington, he is already a famous man, but after that he is part of history. But not only that, his speech has such a high recognition value. I mean, everybody knows at least this phrase,
I have a dream,
that these words of King have become a fixed part of the collective memory of the 20th century. Just a few speeches of the 20th century not delivered by an American president or a British prime minister are more iconic. And yet it is his last speech that some call King's best or more likely most tragic speech. This could also be due to its dark prophetic quality. For only one day after his "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, King is assassinated. Darkly prophetic because in the last speech he talks about his own mortality. He talks about an assassination attempt made against him a few years earlier that he barely survived. And he talks about a future without him. He talks about being able to see the finish line, the promised land, with reverence to Moses. But he will no longer be able to accompany his brothers and sisters there. But together, we as a people will get to the promised land. And although this year is the 60th anniversary of I Have a Dream, today is not about that. I leave that to the others. Nor is today about King's life and legacy. Today, Your History Fox talks about the conspiracies that led to Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. I mean, you know my preferences for this. So call me a conspiracy theorist, but I want to make one thing clear right now. The assassin was not the lone wolf James Earl Ray, or as King's friend James Bevel would say more bluntly, there is no way a 10-cent white boy could develop a plan to kill $1 million black man. Almost every famous American had to reckon with being assassinated sooner or later in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King in 1968, and Robert F. Kennedy just 2 months later in the same year. These high-profile assassinations were important in their own right, but they were also only the tip of a very large iceberg. Almost every major national leader of the black struggle in the United States was assassinated. Not just Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. got assassinated, but also Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights activist in Mississippi. Various members of the Black Panther Party, including Fred Hampton in Chicago, who was only 22 when he was killed by the Chicago police in his bed in the middle of the night. They all had one thing in common. They were on a very special list, literally a hit list, so to speak. You made it onto this list if you caught the attention of the wrong people, if you challenged the status quo. Feminist organizations, the Communist Party of the USA, anti-Vietnam War organizations, Black Power movements, and of course civil rights movements made it onto this list. But why was there such a list in the first place, you ask? Well, all of these groups on the list had in common that they were officially believed to have ties to the USSR and communism. This was a legacy of the paranoia created by the McCarthyism with its anti-communist hysteria. Therefore, this list initially took its raison d'etre only in fact at some point it was no longer about persecuting everything that smelled like communism, but about preserving the racist, patriarchal and of course capitalist system, and therefore hunting down people who wanted to defend themselves against this inequality, because they were attacking precisely those injustices that benefited a certain very powerful group. The Black Power and Civil Rights Movement, for example, demanded an end to the racial discrimination of the American society. But this racial stratification has always been an important part of the United States experience, from slavery to the present. Threatening that order and threatening that white privilege and white supremacy was a threat to the basis of America. The assassinations just underline how important it was. But now to the much more interesting question, whose list was it? Who was responsible for the systematic persecution of political and civilian troublemakers? Well, you guessed it, a powerful white man who was given almost limitless power to carry out his operation. FBI's ultimate G-man, J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar, America's top cop, the director of the FBI, has left some scars in American history and society. For decades, in the name of national security, he spied on thousands and thousands of citizens, infiltrated and sabotaged civil and political organizations, and disrupted social movements by the most perfidious means. The broader chilling effect on political activism and free speech would have impacted even more people. Hoover leaves behind a deep and justified distrust in state institutions and the American government. Hoover launched the Counterintelligence Program, or for short COINTELPRO, in 1956, just as King was rising to national prominence as a leader of the civil rights movement in the Montgomery bus boycott. Hoover himself ordered FBI agents to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize anything that would endanger national security. These measures were intended to prevent violence and maintaining the existing social and political order. As you can imagine, these covert operations were illegal. Hoover, with his FBI, was waging an active covert war against parts of the American society. Some historians even call it the Great American Inquisition. Initially, of course, it was to root out and eliminate communists. But then the measures were directed more and more against Black power and civil rights movements because, well, they are demanding social and legal justice, so they must have been communist. Anyways, after Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, Hoover decided to turn all the forces of COINTELPRO on King. Hoover's assistant Sullivan noted, in the light of King's powerful demagogic speech, "We must mark him now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security."
Dr. King, it's been alleged that you have been slow to sever your ties with alleged communists in the civil rights movement, even after government officials have warned you against them.
First, I'd like to say that communism is based on an ethical relativism, a metaphysical materialism, a denial of human freedom, and a crippling totalitarianism that I could never accept.
King was officially not a communist. He was cautious about expressing in public thoughts that would be interpreted as communist, because then one could quickly lose the broad masses of Americans in the debate, and he knew that. But he also once said that something is wrong with capitalism, and that there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. In small circles, King said that in America the problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. As a Christian, he distanced himself from the Marxist-Leninist doctrine, of course, but he understood that capitalism had brought so much evil upon the world. Nevertheless, it was to be a few years later before he publicly expressed these thoughts. What he did express publicly earlier, right after I Have a Dream in '63, was his attitude toward the FBI. King condemned how little Hoover cared about white terrorists, after which Hoover publicly called him the most notorious liar in the United States. Because as you know, a cornered rat will bite a cat. Hoover and the FBI waged a full-scale covert war against King. To publicly discredit King and take the movement's head, they first tried to ruin his marriage and tarnish his good image. Hoover had King's house and hotel rooms bugged to get compromising material on the new public enemy #1. And they found something. In November 1964, King is sent an anonymous package. Historians will later call it the suicide package. In this package, King finds a tape that supposedly shows King engaging in, extramarital activities. In the enclosed letter, King is indirectly urged to take his own life. They write, "There is only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." The letter gives King a deadline of 34 days to kill himself. Otherwise, the tape would be given to the press. This was Hoover's tasteless attempt to sully King's reputation and weaken him as the leader of the civil rights movement. King was of course fully aware that the FBI must be behind this, and of course he did not give Hoover what he wanted. Although the FBI stopped wiretapping King's home in April 1965 and his office the following year, it continued investigating him more and more all the way up until his assassination in Memphis on the 4th of April 1968. Okay, so we see that the FBI did not shy away from spying on, sabotaging, and even blackmailing King into suicide in all possible ways. And after the murder of Fred Hampton, and probably also after Malcolm X, we can also say that the FBI men of the COINTELPRO were also quite capable of planning a murder, so why not King's as well? King was becoming more and more of a troublemaker for the FBI. They just couldn't get rid of him. All the efforts to discredit him didn't work. His grassroots following was too strong, and King just wouldn't get tired. He just wouldn't stop showing up, talking and mobilizing. And I guess that's why they had to make him stop. Then happened what may have been the final catalyst for planning the assassination: his speech on the Vietnam War, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. For a long time, King held back on criticizing the war, knowing it would antagonize some large segments of the population and, of course, the government. But King also became increasingly concerned about American militarism and the suffering it was causing in the United States and in other countries. King expressed that the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and evils of racism. It may have been his more radical colleague James Bevel or Muhammad Ali's involvement that encouraged him to talk about it. Or it was King's meeting with William Pepper, who published a photo essay on the effect of napalm bombs on Vietnamese children that finally opened his eyes. He gave his speech on the subject in New York on the 4th of April 1967, exactly 1 year before his death.
The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. So far we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. What do they think as we test out our latest weapons on them, just as the Germans tested out new medicine and new tortures in the concentration camps of Europe? True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring.
In retrospect, his I Have a Dream speech made him a saint. I've been to the mountaintop made him a prophet, and beyond Vietnam made him a target. America's reactions were really harsh. He lost many of his supporters, including President Johnson. The press reacted outraged, with the Life magazine calling him a demagogic slanderer, and the Washington Post declaring that King had diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, his people. The New York Times also called this scandalous speech King's biggest mistake. Considering his assassination a year later, that may even be true. The COINTELPRO then began to further specialize its program, calling it from now on Black Hate. They were afraid that King could be the unifying figure in the civil rights movement, that he could now also unite the anti-Vietnam War movement behind him. The goal was to prevent a messiah by any means necessary. And what is the normal reaction when a messiah appears? Exactly, you try to get rid of him. People really have learned nothing from the Bible. Dr. King had this messiah potential, and before he could fully develop it, he had to be neutralized. In fact, King was already aware after JFK's assassination that he was facing the same fate. To his wife Coretta, he said, "This is what is going to happen to me also. I keep telling you, this is a sick society." On the 4th of April 1968, that's when it happened. On the balcony in front of his room 306 in the Motel Lorraine, King is hit by a bullet. He dies at the age of 39, just as Malcolm X did. King's assassination sent a shockwave through the US. Riots and protests broke out. People got killed, buildings burned down, and hope was lost again. While many leaders and movements continued to fight for civil rights, no single individual replaced him in terms of national influence and stature. The murderous white lone wolf, James Earl Ray, was officially said to be the shooter and thus the murderer of King. He also confessed to the murder, so all clear so far. But then Ray recants his confession. William Pepper, the lawyer who met King a year earlier through his photo essay on the Vietnam War, later represents Ray and the King's family. For many doubt the official version. Taking Hoover's obsession with King in the years leading up to his slaying into consideration, there is a lot to doubt. Pepper will spend the decades after King's death proving that Ray was framed and that Dr. King's murder was a huge government conspiracy involving the police, the army, and the mafia. The only trial to ever have place concerning the assassination of King was held in 1999. 1999, 31 years after the assassination took place, and it was barely covered by the media. After 4 weeks of trial and hearing over 70 witnesses, the jury in Memphis took just 1 hour to come up with their decision. They decided that Lloyd Jarvis, who talked in primetime live about being part of the plot, and co-conspirators, including the government agencies, killed Martin Luther King Jr. The real shooter was a certain Frank Strouser, and the murder was organized by FBI officers working under J. Edgar Hoover. James Earl Ray was the fall guy. In 1997, shortly before Ray died of liver failure in prison, King's son Dexter asked Ray at a meeting,
Did you kill my father?
No, I didn't, no.
Dexter, his siblings, as well as Coretta, along with Pepper, dedicated themselves to finding the truth. The witnesses and evidence proved a government conspiracy against King and thus that James Earl Ray was wrongfully convicted. Oddly enough, official sources still say that Ray was the killer, a lone racist perpetrator, and that all other claims are conspiracy theories. Since many documents from the FBI are still sealed until 2027, we have to be patient until the last ones acknowledge that King was a victim of a conspiracy that bears Hoover's signature. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, leave a like or subscribe to History Folks. I leave the last words for today to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now. because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.